Welcome everyone to our dialogue with the author today. My name is Dawn Dole and I'm the Executive Director for the Taos Institute. It is an exciting day today as we explore a new book by Kenneth Gergen. As we begin today, the dialogue with the author is a series of monthly conversations we have with authors of new or books that we just want to highlight around constructionist practices. The Taos Institute is a nonprofit educational organization. Our mission is to bring together scholars and practitioners concerned with the social processes essential for the construction of reason, knowledge, and human value, and their application in relational, collaborative, and appreciative practices around the world. The Institute is committed to the belief that social constructionist ideas have powerful and positive implications for human life and well-being. And this group of scholars and practitioners came together for the very first time in the early 1990s and created the Institute around these ideas and practices. And the Institute is actually a space of learning. It's not a place. We have no physical structure or office. The original name, the Taos Institute, was actually created because our first two gatherings were in Taos, New Mexico. So that's something that people don't often know about us. We really don't have an office or a place. So I want to introduce Ken. Kenneth Gergen is a founding member, one of the founding members of the Taos Institute, and currently the president of the Taos Institute. He is an emeritus professor of psychology at Swarthmore College. Ken has also served as honorary professor at the University of Buenos Aires. He has received honorary degrees from Tilburg University, Athens University, and Saybrook Institute, and he's a member of the World Academy of Art and Science. He has been the recipient of 2 Fulbright Research Fellowships, the Geraldine Mao Fellowship in Hong Kong, along with fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation and the Japanese Society for the Promotion of Science, and the Alexander Humboldt Stuffling. Ken has published over 300 articles in journals, magazines, and books, and among his major books are The Saturated Self, Realities and Relationships, An Invitation to Social Construction, Relational Being, and his one of his newest books, The Tyranny of Testing, Relational Evaluation in Education. And today we are going to be hearing from Ken about his new book published by the Taos Institute, The Relational Imperative. So we're really excited about that. And I want to welcome Ken to our dialogue with the author today. And again, welcome all of you who are joining in. Please use the chat for your questions and keep yourself on mute. And we are going to be together for the next hour and a half or so. Maybe a little bit less now because it's 10 after the top of the hour. So welcome. And Ken, I'm going to turn it over to you. Let me spotlight your video here.
Okay, Dawn, thank you. Thank you. And thank you for coming to this. Actually, I feel a little humbled because so many of you have actually contributed in many, many different ways to what I'll say. Your work is, I've appreciated it. I've been inspired by it. It has been part of the conversation which has led to the writing of this book. And in many ways, I could just highlight many of you and put you on just as well as my speaking. Now, let me talk a little bit about the book, and then later we can go to questions and you can put those into the chat and perhaps Dawn can summarize them later. Just a little bit on the background of the book. The actual writing of the book was inspired by Mary, who'd been wanting me for a number of years to take the Relational Being book, which is a fairly thick treatise, and to take that material and to bring it into bite size and make it simple so that it could travel. we had done this together, Mary and I, a number of years ago on a book on social construction. And that had been very successful. It was just a primer, but by putting it into that small form, it had traveled the world and been translated into many languages. And so she wanted me to do that with relational being. I didn't really want to do that because distilling that work is just an effort. And it's always a new thing that one is drawn to. So I kept putting it off. Now, when Mary died about a year and a half ago, I felt somehow I've got to work on that book. I've got to do it. I've got to do it as a kind of commemoration for her. It was a promise I'd made. Keep that promise, do it now. And I guess in some way it was a way of working through grief. But so I started on it. But while I'm working on it in the daytime, in the background of working on that, it's as if there's a gray cloud over the world. It's if there was the pandemic. We're in the middle of the pandemic. Thousands of people are dying. We don't seem to be able to gain control over that. Then there was the environment, and we seemed on the precipice of catastrophe as a world community. And there was the rapid tumbling of our government, of the deterioration of democracy that we had all experienced here. There was a loss in any kind of sense of honesty, either in the press or in politics, a sort of pervasive distrust. And there was international competition, which seemed ever there, ever present, always force of arms right there in the wings. So I'm thinking, we've had thousands of years of living together, and we still haven't got it right. We still can't do it. We haven't solved those problems. They're the same problems in some ways that have been there for centuries, millennia. And at this point, we're reaching a crisis. If we don't get it right in the next 54 years, I don't know where we go. It frightens me. How do we relate? Why have we failed? Now, that really opened up a space because the book was about relating. And the attempt is to generate an alternative way of understanding relating as a process, to open up another space with new possibilities. And in some sense, that's the big message of the book, is that shift in understanding. It's a major shift, and I can't even manage it sometimes myself because I'm so deeply immersed in traditions that we all share. But if you get that right, a lot of things begin to fall in place in terms of practices and ways of rethinking futures. Now, to put it simply, what we inherit as a language for planning, for relating, for generating policies, for having governance, for whatever, is a language of separation. That is our very understanding of the world and what we're doing is based fundamentally on a language of separation. In part, it's because language itself is a separating device. Words are separating devices. But if I put this in terms of, let's say, English language, it's a language of nouns and pronouns. What is there in this space of this room? There's a vase and the flowers and the radio and the seed and so on and so on. Just divide up the room into pieces. It's the same with I and you, me and you, not me, you. It's the same with our language for action, at least in English. We've got transitive verbs, that is where I do something to you. I give you X, I present you, I teach you. Or it's an intransitive verb where I'm doing it. I present, I inform, I arrive. So our language is essentially one in which you are, as separate entities, leaving that problem of relationship as a secondary. And that's the problem to be solved. How do we relate? Because fundamentally are the entities, the separated entities with which the world is populated. So we look at a group, well, look at a relationship as two or more people coming together. So in a secondary creation, the fundamentals are the individuals, groups formed by the members in those groups, families by the members in the family. So always the group becomes a combination of all the individual entities, when we all know that the sum is greater than the parts. And this goes on to looking at the way in which we form communities as separate communities, businesses as separate communities, businesses, governments, nations, ethnic groups. They're all formed as separations. Now, in some way, that's a barren language with which to function in the world. It gives us few possibilities, because we begin with ourselves, for example, in the human case, as an entity. Now, what is my relationship to you? Well, fundamentally, I have myself, and that will favor and has favored a sense that our fundamental task is to take care of ourselves. It basically permeates the social sciences from Freud on, pleasure principle for one, going into economic decision making in terms of maximizing profit, minimizing loss for myself. There are reinforcement theory, and so on. So we understand that basically you're motivated by self-interest. What else is there unless you go into ethics? So what is my relationship to you? Well, immediately it becomes, for one, transactional. That is, you help me, I'll help you. What good are you to me? Depends on what you do for me. Relationships based on profit and loss. If you have too much trouble, I'm out of here, because relationships themselves are artificial. Or I can try to make you do something. I can use power to change you. I can scold you. I can do all sorts of things as just to control you, and vice versa. Again, it's an impoverished way of looking at things. Now, all right, so we have ethics, which in some sense are, at least Western ethics, are pretty much compensatory in the sense that they say, we understand that everybody's out for themselves. We understand self-interest is primary, so please don't do that. Love the other. Be compassionate towards the other. Listen to the other. Help the other. Help the other. Listen to the other. Knowing that we're separated, primarily separated, and we shouldn't just be taking care of ourselves. So indeed, in some way, the ethics, at least Western ethics, pretty much reinforce the basic notion of separation. Now, this is our sort of metaphysics of living together, fundamental separation. How could we do it otherwise? let's look at where all those terms came from. That is, where did the language of separation come from? If you push that back, you realize very quickly that language itself emerges from relationship, from a process of relating, which cannot be reduced to you and me. A word does not become a word in terms of understandable language until we coordinate, until we agree it is a word, and we agree how to use it. Agreement is not something you can do, and it's not something I can do. We can only do it together as a coordinated action, what I call co-action. So that process of coordination precedes the possibility of even having a language. And out of that process, indeed, one can say our entire language of understanding emerges. Our realities begin to take shape in that language, or not. Our values emerge within that language. In some sense, everything I have and am doing emerges out of that process because I could not have done it alone. It required others to join in the process, to somehow be part of that. And I've said this in other contexts, but in a Zoom meeting like this, it's as if we're all in these boxes, as if that's the primary. Left alone in those boxes, we have nothing. There is no meaning if all we had was ourselves in those boxes. Everything that's important about what's going on here is in coordination. It's not in the boxes. It's not in what I say. It's not in what you do with it. It's in the saying and the doing, the saying and what you make of it. I haven't said anything unless you do something with it. And you can't do anything with it unless I've said anything. So the process, this is a big point, process precedes the persons. Not the persons come together to form the process. Maybe so in some biological sense you could say that. But who we are, all that we say and do, what is important to us, what we live for, what we die for, what is significant to us, emerges out of the process. I can't become a teacher unless there are students who are willing to give me that permission. All right? They can't become students without me. So teaching is not something I do alone and I'm responsible. It's a relationship with students. And out of that process, I become a teacher or not, and they become students or not. All right? If I take two politicians and I put them into a debate, they will find very little that they accept in each other. They will find fault in virtually everything the other says. It's inane, it's stupid, misthought, and so on, and vice versa. In some way, they will become enemies. Take the same two individuals, maybe they're at a dinner party or a bar, having a drink after the debate, and they'll talk about, they'll make fun of themselves, they'll make fun of politics, they'll have a good time. Debate is a process. It's a social process. We all know it in the same way we know how to make arguments. But out of that process, they become adversaries. Out in the bar room, it's another process of a context of friendship. They become something else. So what I'm trying to say is that It's the process in which we're engaged, out of which we become who we are. Now, what that means is bringing attention to the process, not who you are and the what not well-being of you or me, but the process out of which well-being, you might say, emerges. How do we focus on the process? How do we articulate it? How do we practice it? Indeed, how could we have an ethic of the process? Because if that process gives birth to all that we can do and say, that is what we should care for, not I take care of you and vice versa. Take care of the process out of which caring becomes something. Make that foremost in our. So, question then becomes, how do you realize that? What does that mean in practice? Now, if you go back to the model of separation, it's very interesting here, because if you have two separate objects, how do you produce change? You have two entities. Well, one object can make the other do something. That's a causal effect, all right? So I bump into you as a billiard ball, or I make you do something by threat. I put you in school and make something happen, education happening. I put you in therapy. I make some wellness happen. There's a causal relationship. Or you can have the individual entity changing itself. That is, somehow it simply works itself out and moves. In some way, given separation, you've got the whole problem of free will. That is, this is science, bump, and free will, this is individuals acting according to their own vision or purposes. Right? In some way, you've got the whole background of empiricist philosophy, boom, as opposed to continental philosophy with its concern with individual feelings and thoughts and so on. So you can almost conceive most philosophic problems set up in terms of separation. How does the world get inside the head? Is it like, are we mirroring or mapping the world so that we are boomed? Or are we rationalists making up mathematics and so on, or concepts to create the world? So you can almost see Western philosophy carried out in those terms of separation. So let's put that aside then. Let's put that on the shelf. How do we focus on relational process, not making something happen, but working with, joining, conjoining to create change? What would that be like? Now, here I have drawn basically from a lot of work that in fact is represented by people in this audience. And I've lived on that work. It inspires me. There's also other work going on in other places, which is fantastic. It fits the grid. I've tried to work that out in terms of sort of three lines that you might say of process. One would be dialogue. Second would be collaborative practices. And thirdly, what I'll call scaffolding. And I'll just say a little bit about the first two because the scaffolding interests me a lot right now. And you'll see why. So dialogue really represents a focus on that process. It is not a thing, it is a continuous process of co-creation. So I get very interested in new practices that move dialogue along. Now, this becomes really quite interesting in another way. Dialogue's been around for a long time as an interest. And in some way, we're trying to get away from the notion that just ordinary conversation is good enough. And the movement, which to me is fascinating, is trying to look at dialogue as a process that can be shaped in various ways, that you can create forms of dialogue that aren't just talking, and that those forms are like inventions. If those forms can be used, they're like major assets to how we relate. Right? It's like the natural sciences are filled with innovative contributions to humanity. They've given us many, many things. The social sciences very little in some way in terms of knowledge, because what we've looked at as knowledge is primarily words on a page. What about inventions of ways of relating? And that seems to me what has been taking place in the last 15, 20 years. How can we make something happen by the way in which we set the dialogue up? Most all of you know appreciative inquiry, just an example. It's just, okay, let's not start with the problem. Let's start with what we really appreciate, and then you move from there. It's a fashioned dialogue. It is a creation, a contribution to how it is we live together. And so it goes on from there. The whole movement and creativity by design is a process of co-creating the new. It's not creativity in the mind of the person, but a form of relating out of which something comes. Forms of dialogic pedagogy, which go beyond Platonic dialogue, which draw classes in to productive conversations. Dialogic classrooms. These are creations. Dialogues for peace building, absolutely essential. How do we do that? What do we inherit from the past that would allow us to take disagreements and regenerate, bring them back to something either normal or positive? So part of the book is trying to focus on those kinds of practices, and whether it's in therapy, healthcare, education, and so on, new practices, and the invitation for us, regardless of our place in life, to build those practices, to create those practices, to draw from each other in building a future with the fashioning of dialogic practice. Collaboration, the same. It's difficult to separate out dialogue from collaboration, but analytically it's important to do that. Collaborative practices where you break down the walls of me, you, and it becomes something we do together. How to build those collaborative practices. Again, there are many examples, and numbers of those are in the book. How can you, here's one from education. How can teachers, administration, and students collaborate on making decisions? Not the administration deciding what goes on, the teachers deciding what happens to students and so on, but that becomes a collaborative enterprise. Students working together in a class instead of each person doing their own work. Collaborative production of knowledge. Certainly in the sciences, this become a major issue because there are few problems that can be solved by any one group of people. So transdisciplinary collaboration, essential. Um, collaborative healthcare. In some way, open dialogue, although it's called open dialogue, is really a collaborative process of creating mental health. That's where you've got a whole group of people working together, collaborating on the outcome, which would be of the well-being of the person involved. Collaborative healthcare, major movement where not only doctors working together now in teams, but now the drawing in of the nursing staff and significantly now the patient, so that the health team becomes one which includes the patient in the decision making, where the patient is part of the team. Right? Again, these are sort of innovations toward breaking walls, bringing us together to do things, and to enrich that process of relating. Collaborative governance, where particularly in local situations, local government works with the people, not we serve you and we make the decisions about you, but that becomes a relational process where we work together to make those decisions. All right, so those are the two sort of major ones, and most of you are immersed in those in one way or another, I suspect. It's a third one that has really commanded my attention, the scaffolding. Everything I've talked about so far tends to be, you might say, grassroots. That is, the people working in local conditions doing things together. But we have what we'll look at as major institutions, education, corporations, governments, which have traditions of functioning, the way we function. And one asked, what kinds of relationships, what sort of process are these scaffolds for? That is, what do they invite us to do? What do they invite us to be? Because it seems to me if any major changes to occur, somehow we've got to get into these institutions and work at that end of things. Education, for me, has been a huge issue. In some way, education is our future. What do we have in terms of students now emerging from our educational system in terms of capacities for relating? If the relational process is prior, what do they know how to do? Where are their skills? Because they're going to grow up with the same ones we had. We take care of yourself. That's what I do. I don't know how to talk with you unless there's something I want from you. Now, if you look at the scaffolding of at least, and again, I speak out of mainly a Western tradition here, the scaffold for our kind of public education, well, you've got, it sets up this kind of relationship. You might say a master-slave relationship. I tell you as students what to do. I set the curriculum. This is a lesson plan. These are the requirements. You do them. That's primary part of education. Second one, threat. Do this or else. Do this or you fail. Do this or you will be eliminated from school. Do this or you will not go to college. You will never have a degree. Do this or in the eyes of your companions, you will be nothing. So in some way, it's publish or perish. Action by threat. And thirdly, competition. Competition among students to get the better of each other. Competition among schools, among nations, to do the best. So we're all competing. Now, there are a lot of outcomes of that situation, that way of setting it up. One is students are miserable. Education, which is set by standards of that sort, seems irrelevant to most of what's going on in the world. People only learn to pass tests to get out of there. Students live a life in which they're under continuous threat, and they can't trust friends because everybody's out for themselves. So they drop out, or as we've seen at least in the last 2 years, a kind of crisis in mental health, as we put in our school system here in the United States. And again, with no outcome, no positive outcome from the way we relate. What did I learn to do is to relate to other people in my education? Ask yourself. I know how to protect my own opinion. I know how to find fault with you. I'm trained basically as a PhD. I'm a trained shark. There's nothing I know I can't deconstruct with argument. What kind of education is that? Where did I ever learn to relate positively to people, to join with them, to listen to them, to build on them, integrate them? That's been a long, long haul for me personally. And I count myself fortunate to have people in this audience who've been able to help me out of that tradition. I've learned a lot from many of you. So that educational process as a scaffold for the future of what we're doing is deadly. Now that for Chateau Gill, I think is in the audience, as was my accomplice, was the basis for the Tyranny of Testing book, looking for relational practices of evaluation. Because our thinking was look, there are these pockets of really good things that are going on in terms of dialogic pedagogy and collaborative practices in classrooms. There's some wonderful things going on, but they're stifled by the fact that everything has got to be graded and automatically put into some kind of standardized form where we can evaluate everybody on a continuum. And some people will be left feeling great, others I'm just average, and others will drop out. So the point of that book was to say, look, scour the world for practices where evaluation becomes dialogic, where it's not I evaluate you and threaten you, where we work together. What are you trying to do? What do you want to accomplish? How can I help you? How can we make progress with that? This is some things you should think about. Bring in parents, not just as waiting for the latest report card to see whether you've been doing your work or not, but as part of the process of helping that process of learning go on with feedback. So the attempt is if you generate a valuation system which is relationally rich, in which we come to care for each other, which scaffolds caring and co-commitment, you can then open the door to pedagogical practices which have the same flavor, which emphasize what it is we do together. I've been talking too much, but I get carried away with these things, and I have to finish on one more threatening note, and one I wish you could help me with. It's about government. It's about democracy. As I've watched that process totally deteriorate in this country in the last 6 years, basically. Democracy is only held together by a thread of agreement. There are no foundations other than the coordination. There are no laws, there are no Supreme Court, there are no military force that work without coordination. Drop that away, laws don't mean anything. Courts don't mean anything. Anyway, so look at democracy, and in some sense, it is a catastrophe just as a form of government, because it's based on the very notion of single individuals, each of whom can, quote, think for themselves. But without each other, what would thinking be? Thinking isn't I think, therefore I am. Thinking is whatever we're going to call that, is whatever its content, however it takes place, it again, it emerges out of the process of coordination. So automatically we've got a condition where everybody is fundamentally out for themselves. What do I think? What do I want? What pleases me? As a building block. Thus yielding parties which take care of me. Parties out for themselves. Fundamentally, we are combatants. And if we happen to agree, although, well, that's nice and fine, but maybe because I want to win the next election. So any power that is, any party that's in power is automatically going to get massive critique by the alternative. Nothing they can do will be looked at as good. What I guess I'm saying here is that the scaffolding for governance, for our getting along together as people, is horrific. Now, clearly we can't do away with government, but the moves towards how we undo that process, how we soften those boundaries, that is a major question for me. How I draw some sustenance from various movements in various countries on relational governance. Again, I refer to them earlier, cases in which governments, at least locally, are working together with people. There are occasional issues of national importance where you've got small countries and you can bring people together. But by and large, somehow the softening of these boundaries is essential. And this moves on to the international level as well. Look what is scaffolded in terms of international relations. The scaffolding is one of competition. Fundamentally, we are each individual unit out for ourselves, and we compete. If you could change that scaffolding, if that wasn't our way of relating, what kind of resources would we free up just from what we spend on arms, trying to protect our turf, trying to make sure we're more powerful than everybody else? Huge amounts of money just down the drain, trying to make sure that we're okay. You change the scaffold for that relationship to something other than competition. We could actually have climate accords where we're not making sure we're not giving more than anybody else. And some people don't agree. And some people agree but don't do it because they have to take care of themselves first. So that becomes a major scaffold to me, and somehow, I'm not sure how to do it, but it seems to me that attention has got to be directed there in any way we can do it. So I've talked too much for a dialogue, and I'm sorry for that, but I hope it's been useful. So, Dawn.
So I'd like to invite people to put your questions in the chat, and I'll take a look at them, and we can, get to as many as we can. We have at least another half hour together. So we were thinking of staying together as a whole group and just taking questions in the chat, if that works for you. Here's one that's coming in, Ken. How do you relate from a relational perspective when you do need others to help you, when one moves to a new environment, when one has a new job? How do you relate without being put down, without feeling inferior? We live in a culture where we play the power game consciously or unconsciously. This is all one question, big question. How do you reach out without being downgraded? How do you deconstruct traditional power relations in a situation? So I don't know where you want to take this multiple question from Zoe Peleg Baker, but I'll give it to you.
So much depends on context. And are we talking about power relations where there are small minorities being terrorized in a country? Or are we talking about taking a new job in which one is at the lower end of the continuum and people don't trust you or don't want you there and so on? So a lot depends on context. How do you do that? Secondly, there are no answers. There's answering. That is, the thing about dialogues and relations, you are continuously alive, and you can't program them. To program them changes what they are. So they're in continuous motion. So every context will be a moving context in which innovation is an ongoing necessity. It's more like looking at knowledge of how to do things, not as being in an orchestra, but being in a jazz musician. So there aren't any answers. There's only a process of answering in which, and again, why I like these sort of dialogic and collaborative practices is that if you have an array of practices, it's like having an array of vocabularies for action. It's like having a whole mass of forms that you can take in the process. I mean, if you look at, let's say, the training of therapists, a huge amount of training of how to relate, in a sense, watching others do it, deliberating about it, having other people watch you, watching videos and so on of how you do this thing, because every client, every patient is different, and the conversations will be different. So a good therapist will be, in some sense, a master of improvisation. Now, as an aside, I've often wanted to say, look, why don't we give that attention to the clients or patients themselves? If problems and the names of problems grow out of relational process, rather than, let's say, having a new narrative, what about having the capacity for narrating under many circumstances, being able to make up the story with others in those conditions? So yes, one could say, look at what others have done under those circumstances. What have minorities and countries done in order to remove that kind of pressure and that power structure? And there are cases from which one can draw. So I don't have the answer, but depending on context, it would actually be fun to sort of see what others might say about that. How would they do it? What do they know about it? how can we generate the resources for those particular conditions?
And here's one from Kathy Sharp is just asking you, what is giving you hope?
Look, one of the major sort of lessons of living is how to be a good suppressor. That is, not only tuning into things, but suppressing everything else. There was a cartoon in the New Yorker a couple of years ago. I guess I used it in a book, actually, of a person sitting in bed, with everything is black, and all the problems of possible problems that he could have were sitting there on the board behind him. So hope is partly a matter of not looking at all the threats at once, and partly having people like who are here, who can generate a sense of, yes, we can do that. Yes, it's possible. Yes, there's reason for hope. I draw hope every time I read something or talk to many of you. It's a wellspring of hope for me. And yeah, without each other, I don't know where the hope would be.
Thanks, Ken. We've got lots of questions coming in. Here's one there's several on education, but one question is about how do we deal with the need to evaluate students in a traditional system? Let's see if there's another one about education. Yeah, maybe just deal with that one and then we'll move on there. Like I said, there's quite a few questions coming in. So once something about evaluation in traditional systems.
You have to, first of all, ask what's presupposed by that, as if there are some standard of what counts as being educated. And part of the difficulty, and there's a lot of agreement, that standardized education, first of all, is not the future. Standardized education is failing us because we don't know what we're going to need. And if you just have one standard, this is what everybody needs, and that's not relevant to the future, you cut off your hands. So what you want to do is to open up the potential for what counts as education. So it's not necessarily book learning. It could be many, many different things. Enrich the potential of what is possible to learn and the enthusiasm behind that. So now what that's going to do is to eliminate standardization. If you open up curricula to freedom, there is no standardized grading. And evaluation becomes local and within context. All right. So you may have some broad agreements about what is valuable, but you wouldn't have the kind of, if we don't have scores, we don't know whether people know anything, which is totally misleading as a way of evaluation in the first place. Everything one knows to pass a test in year one will probably be forgotten by year two. They couldn't pass the same test because knowledge isn't cumulative like that. Knowledge must be continuously made in the process of living. So that whole form of education becomes deeply problematic. And evaluation becomes, as I say, the way in which Chateau and I put it, is deeply dialogic.
So in education, if faculty were could be seen and were allowed to see themselves as mentors who are growing students, would that lead to better scaffolding?
I'm sorry, if teachers
Mentor, like teachers as mentors as opposed to directing down.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, mentoring is a possibility, supports, advisors, coaches, co-creators. I like very much Ingeborg Malen's school in Norway, in which the students are called learning colleagues, young learning colleagues. So we have older and younger learning colleagues. Everybody in the school is a learning colleague. I mean, mentoring is okay, but what if it's the reverse too? I learn with you. I mean, everybody here who's got a teenage kid knows that they're more advanced than you technologically. As most teachers in elementary school quickly learn, their students know more about the world than they do collectively. Things that they never even dreamed of.
And here's a couple questions on democracy. If one takes democracy as a noun, is a problem. If one takes it as a process, then there are resources for change. So democracy is not a noun, but a process.
Yeah.
And then somebody else about the democracy, the challenges of competition and individualism in democracy. Should we look for another form of governance? There's a Thomas Ibanez, a Spanish constructionist scholar, invites us to look at anarchism. What are your ideas about it? How can we build a just and equal society?
Well, I would go to Thomas, and I know his history on this. Could one have a benign anarchism? Possibly. That would be fun to think about it. I do like the idea of moving to process. And organizational scholars have done a pretty good job of looking at organizations from like machines, which are set up in a sort of technically productive way, to looking at organizations as forms of conversation. And there's a lot written on that and a lot of good work. Government should be the same way. That is, should get rid of the noun. It's looked at as a continuous process, and it does open up the idea of, well, okay, maybe we can't eliminate the whole government. You can't just jump out of tradition suddenly, and that's where I worry about moving to anarchy. That is, traditions are too heavy, unless you could move together. So if you look at it as a process, how could you soften the process? Could you get competing parties, for example, together to talk about where could we work together? How could we soften? How could we make democracy work? We were doing this. How could we make it work? You could set in motion new forms of process, as I see it, which could be done. Now that's me. I tend to think even though I think everything is held together only by agreement, some of these agreements go back a long way, and it's not so easy to jump out of history, which makes me a little more conservative, having been on the front lines of a lot of different in the streets demonstrations over my career.
There's a couple questions on imagination, creativity, improvisation. Relationality requires rather than invites embracing creativity. So I don't know if you want to comment on some of that.
I don't know what the issue there is.
Here's one. Would it be beneficial to use our minds, our imagination, our mental capacity to foresee, to hold a relational vision in every particular situation?
Now, this is off the top of my head, but it's important to me. You know, I can talk theoretically about this, and I can point to practices, but in terms of being in conversation at a given time, it's often difficult to step out of the reality of that's being co-created, or step out of the dance to ask, what kind of dance is this? All right. If, for example, one of you were to pretty much attack me right now and say that's rubbish, which in some ways it is, I'm sort of thrown back into a tradition in which I'll counterattack. It's hard for me to step out just because I've lived these dances to say, hey, wait a minute, don't do that, don't go there. It's difficult to be both cognizant of the form of the process that is unwinding and unfolding when you're in it. So I'm not saying zero, I'm getting better at it, but it's hard to be doubly conscious and in some sense be authentically engaged in the moment with that person, and also conscious of what kind of trajectory were we on here? Where is this leading? So again, to me, education is a big part of it. If some of this now over time becomes almost the way I am. I'm not thinking about it. I'm just doing it. I know if my voice goes in a certain register, I just don't let it do that if I can. It just doesn't feel right. Let me go back to something else which becomes interesting for me. Ethics. Now, where does anyone learn ethics? Because we pretty much try to make our schools ethics clean because we don't want our kids corrupted by some religious position we don't believe in. So we tried to make science ethically clean. We put religion in the margin, saying, well, that's fine on the weekends, but that's not daily life. And where does one have, you can learn ethics abstractly, and you can be told to be nice to people, but again, if you're not in the process where niceness is part of the process, it's difficult just to do it anytime you want. So anyway, my vision of what education could be like, if collaboration, dialogue, mutual support, mentoring, and so on is what we do, is the creation of ways of relating, the ethics can be built into the very form of being, not something which has got to be abstractly learned and which you somehow have got to remember. It becomes a way of life. It becomes a way of relating to each other. So education in its best sense would be ethical to its core if it were process sensitive, if the process were the prior, take care of the process.
Thank you, Ken. Some more on political questions. So here's one from Mark Freeman. Right now in the political world especially, it often seems that people are inhabiting fundamentally different realities, and that these are or appear to be utterly impermeable and immovable. What might be done to move beyond this frequently hostile and violent impasse?
That's one of the frightening things about the way, information technology adds a whole nother layer to these issues because people can find each other and collaborate or coordinate into a group which stands for something. They can do that overnight, and they can get into that group, what we now call bubbles, 24/7. So the possibility for separation of realities is enormous at this point. Fragmentation everywhere. Whatever wild thing you can imagine, there's a group probably in the world which is being built around that right now, who agrees that that wild thing is true or right. And it also allows you to criticize whatever else is without being in contact with it. So it's anonymous critique. So that world of creating alternative realities is in some way out of control. And well, I won't go there, but okay. Now, given that, two things. And one of them has been asked about hope. Everything that I may say I hold dear, everything I would be committed to or I think is real, I have another voice. I have many, many different voices. So I may say that publicly. I may say it often enough. I may, in quote, have an investment in it. But if you push me, I know the critiques of that. I know I have other things I'm invested in. For everything I hold ethically dear, I have ways of saying, no, it's not ethically dear. It's problematic. It's harmful to other people. For everything I hold dear, I've got some other voices that say, that's not dear. And one of the great things about the Public Conversations Project as a peacemaking effort has been within their dialogues of peace building across different realities, is have a period in which they say, tell us your doubts. Tell us about occasions where you're not quite sure. And people have them, they come up. So I'm saying, yes, we may look like we're in these different bubbles of reality, but that's not all we're in. That we carry with us multiple voices. And I could take anybody on any political side, I could put them on the other side, and they could make the arguments for that side probably pretty decently. They know them, but they're not the group they're in that they can espouse them. So that offers me some hope. Can you find the process which would open that door to the alternative realities that we all carry as well?
Here's from Marlene Ogawa from South Africa. We also need to work together in micro and macro spaces into larger systems of collaboratives toward positive action and change, but it surely starts with the individual. How are we each showing up and open ourselves up to be in relationships with others, from individuals into systems we are part of? So I don't know if you can comment on that.
Yeah, well, first of all, there's a sort of conceptual problem is what is the individual within a relational view? They don't start with the individual. Ask what it is the individual carries from past relationships. All that I have to say, for example, I didn't make any of this up. I do all the words, I didn't originate them. I'm just carrying conversations, dialogues, readings, relationships. It's just now coming out here. So I'm like a conduit of relational process. But don't look at me as it's coming out of my head. Not coming out of my head, it's just a way station for doing relationship. So what do I show up with? Enormous potential. Enormous potential. And that's why I was saying multiple realities, multiple ways of putting things, multiple ways of being with people. How do you show up? What is the process that you hope to invite people into? As all you can do is move in ways that invite, Again, we're doing away with causality here. It's more like, what do I invite if I say, oh, to my colleagues, for example, who are pretty much opposed to constructionism. They're pretty empiricist, measuring people. If I show up and I say, tell me about your work, I'm really interested. Okay, brighten up. They've got all sorts of things to say, and they will frequently come back and ask me about my work, and they will begin to get into that. But if I show up and say, look, with another view I have, I think this is a bit silly, which is there, we're not going to go anywhere. We're just going to close our office doors and not speak to each other. So what is the relations you'd like to invite, and what capacities do you have to invite that?
And similar to that, Ken, the everyday operationalization of relational ideas is challenging within the context of Western individualistic cultures. So within that inherent separation language. So certainly it takes a collective effort to transform our prevalent habits of thinking and acting from the individual to the collective.
Well, let's be a little careful here. And I agree that I can't step out of Western history until, my own background to comment on everything. There's just too many variations. But I spent a lot of time in China and Japan. And there is a lot more care in those traditions for the relational process. I mean, how that works out changes over history. But what I don't want to do is privilege community, that is the we, because that has also been, if I don't act like the community, then somehow I'm voiceless or incarcerated, because that's not the world. Community is yet another thing, another boundary. And in the contemporary world, we are now moving with global conversations without end, as I've tried to say. So you can't prize community in the ways it has been done, with certain rituals, which have been key to, I think, Japanese harmony, with Confucianism as an emphasis on harmony of we, and if you don't do it that way, it's wrong. That is, I do think within Confucianism and Taoism and so on, there are perspectives which fold very easily into a relational view. The co-arising of humanity, for example, in Buddhism would be another one. So there are these traditions which feed into this, which support that way of thinking, but they have to be open to a world now in which our capacities to move with multiplicities is just expanding exponentially.
And Rick Span here, he's been in the chat. There's quite a bit of conversation going on about improvisation and jazz and using that metaphor and that practice, that process. And he says, from the improvisational stance, like in music, dance, theater, dialogic communication, is paid attention to is the transcending the dichotomy between the individual and the group by focusing on the quality of the co-creation of the groove. Individuals become personalities, their groove, individuals become their personal story. I think it's bouncing around here, so I'm having a hard time. The group becomes a living and co-created context for the jam, all committed to evolution and emergence of the unprecedented cool social stuff of the benefit of the bigger band and all the players within it. So I don't know, it's kind of a fun way to look at what you're talking about, if you want to comment on that or anything else.
Well, I love, for example, this whole movement toward improv. East Side Institute, one of those places I really look at with admiration, but places in which where the improv together becomes the process is everything. And it opens up one's own being to you become familiar with the voices that you carry, familiar with what you carry from the past and the way in which you can put it into practice and what happens when you put it into practice. Same with jazz, but it's a little bit more refined. And I love the theory behind jazz. I love Frank Barrett's say yes to the mess, whatever's going on, say yes to it and move with it to create something out of it. Those are wonderful metaphors and have with some practical capacity, capabilities, implications.
So Ken, just one, Tanya Cruz from Teller from South Africa also invites people to look at another Taos publication that we have, and we can move into talking about all of the publications that the Taos Institute offers, but she's been part of a book called Thriving Women, Thriving World, an invitation to dialogue, healing, and inspired action. And it's a book of questions to bring to groups and different contexts that you're a part of to help create a thriving world. So it's a wonderful book of questions that help jumpstart these kinds of conversations and dialogues.
Yeah. No, it's a great contribution. And again, I think there's room there for voice after voice. I mean, there's no one book that's going to do it. In fact, books are just openings to what ultimately got to be an education practice. It ultimately is a way of being, and which can't be, again, programatized. So yeah.
Yeah, so Ken, we're about to wrap up here. I'd like to give you a couple more minutes to just wrap up, and then I've got some closing comments.
It's impossible for me right now to summarize all this. I want to apologize again because I've monologued too much. That's it.
I think when we have a large group like this, it is a challenge, but I do appreciate everyone who contributed in the chat. We do have this recorded. We can make it available. You're welcome to share it with other people to start your own conversations and ways of looking at your own arenas that you're working in and living in. And again, it's this spreading out of the ideas and inviting people. And I think a lot of things in the chat were about inviting people into these kinds of conversations in your workplace, in your communities, in your homes. So it's an ongoing process of relating. These dialogue with the authors are about once a month, so you can continue to look for others. The Taos Institute also offers some online learning opportunities. Please check out our website. We have some online courses coming up. Sheila McNamee and Harleen Anderson have one coming up the end of February, which is on dialogic and collaborative practices for challenging times. And we have our first ever online course that's going to be offered in Japanese. We're really excited about that. It's Ken's course that he has on his book, Relational Being. And we've got a couple colleagues in Japan who are translating that whole course into Japanese. So we're really excited about that. So we welcome all of you to continue on with these dialogues, these conversations. Get involved in the Taos Institute in whatever way you feel called to. We want to just continue on together. So Thank you so much for being part of this conversation. And if anybody wants to come off mute and just say a word of how you're feeling right now, we can just do like kind of a popcorn. I'm going to turn you off from speaker view, Ken, and bring everybody back onto gallery view.
Yeah, thank you, by the way, everyone. I really appreciate your being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. And if anybody wants to come off mute and just say a word, that would be great. Or put it in the chat. It's just so wonderful seeing everyone.
It was a great pleasure.
Thank you, Dawn. Wonderful.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Ken. Thank you, Joe. Thank you, everyone.
Jesse.
Thank you very much.
Thank
you.
you.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Obrigada.
Inspiring as ever.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.